Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you wherever you are. Um, it's a great pleasure to be here. This is the MENA Mix series of IMEO's podcast. And I'm very pleased to be one of the hosts, Hisham Hellyer. I'm a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies in London, and also at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. It's a great privilege to be able to co-host this with my colleague, my friend, and my fellow member, as we might put it, of IMEO, Noha. So please, Noha, would you introduce yourself to our audience?
Thank you so much, Hisham. The pleasure is all mine. Good morning and good evening to everyone who will be listening to us. My name is Noha Alkamcha, and I am a governance advisor and an international development practitioner. I work in the MENA region, based in the MENA region, specializing in the Levant countries, primarily working with civil society organizations, supporting grassroots initiatives on strengthening their governance structures and economic development, work portfolio. I previously moved from the United States to Turkey to work on Syria. And from Syria, I started working on the Levantine countries, and it's all connected. Thanks, Hisham.
It's great to be with you, Noha. And it's great to be able to discuss the region with somebody who's from the region, of the region, and is really invested in the region. One of my biggest sort of gripes as an analyst is so often in the analytical arena, and also to some extent the media arena, which explains a lot of the coverage. You have outsized, how should we say, impressions and influences from people that are not in the region, do not really spend much time in the region, more often than not, don't speak any of the languages of the region even. And I find that when it comes to Middle East, this is really quite exceptional. You never have people being touted as experts on quote unquote European affairs and not know at least, one or two languages, let alone, somebody from in South American studies not knowing Spanish or Portuguese. And yet this is incredibly common when it comes to the wider Arab world slash Middle East. So it's really a great pleasure to be with you here today. We're going to be discussing the country that I know is closest to your heart, which is Syria, but we'll also be talking about some other topics as well. Because, of course, this particular region isn't one where, especially in over recent months and years, it doesn't sit still, right? There's not really a day that goes by where there isn't some kind of flux, there isn't some kind of movement, and important things, really important things, things that really have ramifications, not simply within the region, but beyond it. And of course, the first topic, I wouldn't be able to do this otherwise if we didn't have this as the first topic, that springs to mind is what's happening in Gaza.
Course,
What's happening in to be more precise, in the Palestinian occupied territory of Gaza. Also a framing that I think is very important because A, it's accurate, but also it's contested, but it's only contested by the occupier, right? Where you have Gaza being an occupied territory, having been in occupied territory since 1967, uninterrupted, despite the fact that there was the quote unquote disengagement plan of Israel in 2005. It did not cease to be an occupied territory as a result, as the ICJ has made abundantly clear, and the world, more generally. But of course, the Israelis dispute this. And I think it's important because it also levies certain types of responsibilities on the occupying power if it's recognized as an occupied territory. And the Israelis have certainly not lived up to that over the past almost 20 months. It's astonishing. Can you imagine? It's been 20 months.
I
Um,
mean, like we're on the margins observing, we're living this day to day, every single day through the news, through our work, through, the communities that we were part of. I mean, it's pretty much a war, a prolonged catastrophe that is pretty much ignored, and historical context is also ignored. As you mentioned, Hisham. I mean, when it happened, when October 7th took place, everyone, the entire world and the entire globe completely ignored the fact that there was a specific historical context that led to October 7th. I mean, you have this occupied territories for I don't know how many years. What do you expect them to do? Send you love letters? Of course, this was bound to happen, unfortunately. Not that, we in any way or shape or form, none of us wanted that to happen or expected it to happen. But when it did happen and it took place, the world was acting like, oh, it's a shock. Of course, I mean, Netanyahu has been waiting for this moment to enter Gaza and occupy the land. And a lot of people tend to ignore that reality.
No, I think it's quite extraordinary because, of course, we are now. By the time this airs, I suspect we would have already passed the 600-day point of Israel's war on Gaza. And 600 days in, we've seen a change in rhetoric, right? So you had different rights groups, different NGOs, including Israeli rights groups and Israeli NGOs, describe as what's happening in Gaza as a result of Israeli action as a genocide. But and you started seeing that, months ago. But what's quite new, I think, is that over the past few weeks, you've seen rhetoric change from even Western political leaders. So as I was getting ready for this particular podcast, I saw that the Irish Prime Minister had declared, I mean, this was, I think, the first time that he said this is a genocide in Gaza, and he said it in Parliament. Spain's Minister of Social Rights called it a genocide as well. Belgium's Foreign Minister called it a genocide. And of course, after he left the post, Joseph Borrell, who is the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, he called it a genocide, but after he left. And I think that it's quite striking. You see, because of course that's not happening with everybody, right? You do see that sort of change in language being limited to particular quarters. But beyond that, and this was something that I thought would be good for us to discuss, beyond that, you do see a shift in discourse in different Western capitals and countries. Less so in the United States, where I think it's the most significant in terms of shifting what happens on the ground. So you haven't really seen rhetoric change as much within the United States, but you've certainly seen it within the UK, across Europe. The EU has come out and said that they're going to have a review into the EU-Israel Association Agreement. So you have all these different pieces coming out saying the world is waking up at last to the extent of horrors in Gaza. That was a headline in the Times. And different European allies say they will take concrete actions over Gaza and so on. And, I wonder, will they? What exactly are we to expect, going forward?
I think it's the tipping point. Right now, we are at the tipping point stage. Like you said, for 20 months almost, I mean, most Western governments stuck to the Israel has the right to defend itself line. Sure, agreed. But the images and the stories that are emerging from Gaza, amplified on social media and, causing some public pressure, started to cut through. And that's in addition to that change, there is internal criticism from very much within Israel. Like you have retired generals, former prime ministers who are actually calling this war crimes, which what I think led the EU country to start to change that tone. It's great that we're seeing change in tone, but I think it's very slow. And it's not clear where is that gonna take us? Like the UK is discussing suspending trade agreements or imposing sanctions on Israeli settlers and some Israeli companies. Like you said, Ireland is basically, they called it a genocide, but they're also working on legislations banning imports from settlements. France is co-leading a two-state solution conference in June. They are going to recognize the state of Palestine at the UN Security Council, urging the UK to do the same, as well as Canada. And then the EU review of the agreements, trade agreements with Israel. So all of that is great, but is it enough? And what are the actions out of this condemnations? Is it going to really pressure Israel? Because we saw the response that came from the Israeli government and the IDF, attacking an Italian diplomats, Italian group. I think it was Italian and Europeans. I can't remember actually.
The mixed group you're talking about when they were on the West Bank. Actually, it was a mixed group, Arab diplomats, European diplomats, and they sort of shot in the air over them. But it was really quite an extraordinary
And that
spectacle. Of
didn't receive coverage in the mainstream media
very
either.
little,
It was on
very little.
social media, but like the Times didn't talk about it. You don't see it on US mainstream media in the US. So I think that was a response, in addition to what Netanyahu keeps on saying, that, we have the right to defend ourselves. No one is going to pressure us into anything. And, I think, is it enough? I don't think so.
So it's interesting, right? Because, for example, this right of self-defense, it's in international law. But when you combine that right of self-defense with the duties of an occupying power in an occupied territory, the rights that Israel has as an occupying power is similar to the rights it would have if a gang had come out of Tel Aviv and attacked Jerusalem or something. It's not the same as, a foreign state attacking and then giving Israel the right to defend, in international law. So actually, on the legal level, the duties and responsibilities of an occupying power, they're about maintaining the welfare of the population. This whole like self-defense part doesn't really come into it in comparison at all. But also, when you mentioned Israeli figures, Ehud Olmert, who
Yes.
was Prime Minister of Israel, had a very, one has to be very clear, had a very controversial history as well, because his actions as Israel's Prime Minister, many would claim and suggest that they also amounted to crimes of a different nature. But even he came out and said last week that previously he had been defending Israel against the charges of genocide and war crimes, and then in the next he comes to the end of that particular paragraph and says, "I can no longer do so." So he doesn't come out and say Israel is committing genocide, but he does come out and say, "I can no longer defend it against the charge of genocide." And I think that that's quite significant.
It is.
And in terms of what's enough, though, so you mentioned, for instance, the UK. The UK has now said that it's suspending free trade negotiations with the Israelis. Within a few days of that declaration, the UK's official trade envoy, Lord Ian Austin, um, was in Israel and was engaging with the Israelis on a fairly well publicized trip by the UK embassy in Tel Aviv. Um, and of course, beyond the free trade agreement, there's already an extensive relationship between Tel Aviv and London, and that doesn't seem to have changed. So this is where I wonder about the whole, is it enough, right? What's really going on in terms of policy. And I think that's also significant because people also talk about, Donald Trump is very unhappy with Benjamin Netanyahu. There's going to be some sort of shift from within DC, and things are going to change. And we haven't seen anything like that. And it's not because there isn't frustration with Netanyahu. It's not because that Trump doesn't have issues with Netanyahu. I think that's actually been very widely reported. The issue is that this doesn't impact policy. Policy has stayed pretty much the same. Um, And I don't see that changing anytime soon unless there's a lot more change that goes on in terms of actual policy. Um, yeah, it's
I
we're
don't
having this conversation, and the whole famine and starvation situation in Gaza is just really abysmal and awful. One hopes that things will change soon.
Yes, I agree. I don't see, however, anything coming out of DC, even if Trump is frustrated with Netanyahu, who actually thought that, by Trump winning the elections, that he has the magic wand and he can do whatever he wants and nobody can stop him. That was the attitude that Netanyahu was going with, violating the ceasefire following the inauguration day. So I think, you know, DC aside, the European countries have given their condemnations, and they're in review of trade agreements and the Article 2 association agreements between the EU and Israel. The report of that particular review is going to come out on June 23rd. I don't think they're going to make a decision then, but all of that is happening. The review, the pressure, the public pressure between, Western governments and Arab countries. Palestinians are dying and going through starvations and dehumanizations on every single moment.
Yeah.
Basically, Jake Wood, the director of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, resigned, saying you can't deliver aid without feeling that you are complicit. And this is an initiative that was backed by the US and the Israelis to let aid in. I think there has to be a very thorough conversations about how aid is being delivered and blocked by IDF at checkpoints. We have to have thorough conversations about Rafah and what's happening there, the pressure that the Jordanians go through when they want to evacuate Palestine. I mean, they don't want to evacuate Palestinians, but at the same time, they don't want them to live in Gaza. So what do you call that? Really, what's the conclusion? I don't know. So that should be something to be said to these
Yeah.
Western governments who are talking about, condemning the actions of Israel, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, change is happening, but it's very slow and it's very unclear what will be the outcome.
It is very unclear. And, by the time this airs, it might be that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has actually collapsed. In fact, today there were reports that they had sort of backed away from fulfilling even the commitments that they had on the ground for today. So who knows? It wouldn't surprise me because the the success for the GHF um, looked like still really under delivering to the majority of Palestinians anyway. Um, but you mentioned Trump's, magic wand. Well, he did have a magic wand for one thing at least, which I think made a lot of us very, very happy. I certainly myself, and I'm sure you too, because on that trip and tour that Trump made within the GCC, he announced that he was going to lift all sanctions on Syria from the United States. Um, and it was quite a moment. I mean, in Damascus and in cities all around Syria, there were spontaneous celebrations, as I'm sure you saw and enjoyed very much as I did. But I have to say, I was kind of a little bit dubious, and I wasn't so dubious in the sense, oh, he doesn't mean it. I was more dubious about, okay, he can say what he wants, but then he's going to get back to DC, and there are going to be all these people that are going to be, running interference and trying to sabotage. And it looked like that might be the case for a few days. And, somebody obviously got wind of that because then Trump signs the executive order and suddenly everybody falls in line. It's like, no, we're behind the president, and really significant decisions without really any effort at trying to stall things, despite the fact that you had people like Sebastian Gorka and others within the close kind of MAGA circle really not liking the new dispensation in Damascus, yet being essentially overridden, right? So you you had the sanctions decision being, really taken seriously. Um, but I still wonder if there's going to be any conditions that are going to come along at some point. But of course, you've been watching this, I'm sure, even closer. So what do you think?
So I think we as Syrians were very cautiously optimistic and happy, but scared at the same time. I'm not gonna lie to you, because that was the thinking. Even, I mean, first of all, we were happy nonetheless, because this was considered the second victory for Syrians after December 8th, right? But knowing the politics in betweens and that the devil is in the details, we figured that there might be some delays on the
Mm,
back end, preventing this from happening or letting it take years to be implemented. But then we also know that people in the State Department and the Department of Treasury who are working on this are political appointees. So they came with Trump and they will make the executive order happen and implement it. So that was, and we saw progress after Secretary Rubio hearing on why there needs to be lifting of sanctions and what's the hope of it and the list of conditions and so on and so forth. But also on the Syrian side of things is that two things. The General License 25 basically is, we have to emphasize that, it's an Office of Foreign Assets Control, and, they can issue general license that basically do
yeah.
OFAC administrated sanctions. So it doesn't include all of the sanctions on Syria. They do not affect sanctions imposed by other departments, such as the Department of Commerce. They do not include sanctions that are legislated by Congress, such as the Syrian Accountability Act for the designation of Syria as a state sponsor of terrorism. Now, the Caesar Act was suspended for 180 days. And what we're seeing from these sanctions conversations that are happening is that it seemed as a bridging mechanism. There are a list of conditions that the new Syrian government have to, adhere to in order for sanctions to be suspended for the 180 days and then possibly lifted. And there, a lot of criticism saying like, why would Trump make conditions, and this is the Syrian people and this is the Syrian government, so on and so forth. And I think, lifting sanctions on Syria is more of a responsibility for Syrians rather than just a victory. Because the demands that were made by the US government in order to lift those sanctions are extremely important, given that they are the Syrian people demands and will of the new Syrian government as well. So yes, we do not want to be a state basically acting in a pariah, hosting foreign fighters or providing the hospitable environment for that. We do want a transitional justice process and accountability for the detainees. We want former Assad people to be prosecuted in front of our eyes. It's only fair for us to do that, for the families of the victims to witness that. So, we do share this will and those demands. And, Sharia, before legitimizing himself internationally, he has to legitimize himself and his government in front of Syrians. So that's why there is a huge support push from civil society actors on working on peace building and reconciliations, feeding up to the new government and the Ministry of Social Affairs who are working on that day in and day out, and hopefully something will come out.
I hope that's true. And I hope it works out sooner rather than later. I have to say that when it came to the sanctions, as soon as Bashar was forced from power in December, I was a very strong advocate on an analytical level that all of the sanctions had to be lifted immediately. And my rationale in this regard was that the sanctions were imposed because of the Assad regime. So they could not be used for behavioral leverage, legally speaking, ethically speaking. Um, and one thing that I was interested to see was are different governments going to try to impose conditions that actually have nothing to do with anything? Like, so for example, talking about normalization with the state of Israel, things like that. But even other things on a domestic level that again are good things, okay? But as if I'm thinking about this from the perspective of DC or Brussels or London in terms of sanctions, we've imposed sanctions on a number of different countries in the past, and we've also explicitly not done so, despite the fact that on governance, on multi-party democracy and civil rights and so on, they're in a much worse state, right? Um, so it struck me that if we're going to be in the business of now using these sanctions to try to push forward behavioral changes from the government in Damascus, then the consistency in this regard is really lousy. But also where are the benchmarks for this anyway? Um, and I think that on a condition, the conditional sort of part of this, I'm curious, do you think that some of these departments are actually going to impose conditions? Because Trump said nothing about conditions. He said, I'm lifting everything.
I mean, that's what he said, but there are the technicalities that I mentioned in distinctions between what the executive branch is going to declare and say versus the legislative versus the Congress. And all of these are basically, there is a force of Syrian Americans in DC working on this, right?
Mm.
And those who are within the administration are still not in favor of lifting sanctions are
Yeah,
still do their best. But then the card that is basically that I could tip things is the political appointees, because this was also a deal with MBS.
yeah,
This was a
yeah.
request by the Saudi prince to lift sanctions on Syria. So, but again, with those conditions, I want to stress enough on the fact that the new Syrian government, for them to gain any sort of legitimacy, there has to be an inclusive nation building.
Mhm.
Syria is completely destroyed. It's below zero, like from institutions, state institutions to infrastructure to services to invest. There's nothing. And the first priority of the new government is the economic recovery. Yes, important, needed. We need to attract new investments. We need to rehabilitate the economy, but also security would be a prerequisite for all of that to happen.
I think
Inclusive
so.
nation building, transitional justice. If there's no transitional justice, there will be no reconciliation, and then we dive into ethnic, and sectarianism problems that will happen for sure if we don't include minorities within the government. He did include them in his new cabinet, but there has to be on a much deeper level within state institutions. And of course, we have to be in compliance with international standards. So I think they're working on that, but also in their favor, they've received, a country that has thousands of hollow employees who do not work, who do not
Yeah.
exist. There's no capacity, there's no resources, there's no money to
Mm.
cover all the work that needs to be done. So I think for us, as much as we would like to hold them accountable, but also we know the underlying issues, and we're trying,
Yeah.
I think civil society who exists there is trying to work with the government on these issues for sure.
I think they are, and I'm glad that they are. I think that holding them accountable, um, from the point, as in Syrians holding them accountable, is, a prerequisite for any pathway going forward for Syria. I think my concern from some of the language that I've heard from different people is that they want to use sanctions as a way to hold them accountable. And this, I think, is just completely out of the question because the sanctions were not about accountability for the new government. They were about accountability for the old one, which thankfully is gone. But when one more thing before we move on, because I'm cognizant of time. One of the conditions that I think, unfortunately, is just, and I say unfortunately because it's like of all the things in the world that are important, this is not one of the top priorities in my opinion. But you've seen DC be fascinated over the past 2 years about the prospect of expanding the Abraham Accords and the level of interest in, Saudi is going to normalize with Israel, and they still, I mean, literally up until this very week, I've heard people in DC ask me about, what's happening with this, is it going to happen, and so on. I personally, I don't think it is, but there was this question around Syria, and if Sharia is going to have to normalize with the Israelis, and in normalize, I don't mean a return to the quote unquote status quo ante that Bashar al-Assad had, but actually normalize and join the Abraham Accords in order to get all of these sanctions lifted. Do you think that's a condition that is being imposed? Do you think that it's something that he could do or would do? Or are people just, really stretching here? I have my
So that
answer,
was,
but I'm more interested in
yeah,
yours.
that was a question amongst a lot of Syrians. Trump didn't say, I mean, even in the conference and on his way out of Saudi that day on the plane, he said maybe they will join the Abrahamic Accords at a later
At some,
stage. He didn't say
yeah.
normalization, and he didn't say that was a condition. Nonetheless, I do want to say there is a context there, Hisham. I know that there is a lot of, there's a bit of heat, I would say, from some folks who saw that throwing out the Assad regime is a step back in resisting the occupier and, not in the favor of the Palestinian cause and so on and so forth. Taking Syria, isolating Syria by its own for a second, Syrians are exhausted and they have endured over 15 years of conflict and destructions and in a devastated country and infrastructure. Not just the last 15 years, but
Mm.
decades prior to that of oppression, of, you name it. You know what the Assad the father has done even before that. So as a result, they faced a wave of sanctions and political expulsion, and that severely hindered the development of their countries. Now, Syria wants no more problems. The leadership is signaling a shift, and it no longer wants to be seen as a source of regional instability. Instead, Syria wants to become a stabilizing force. And, this is sort of many Syrians and their leadership view the question of normalization with Israel, but it's deeply complex and layered issues. And I don't think that will happen right away because, like for Syria to move towards normalization with Israel, there are several key issues that must be resolved first. The status of the Golan Heights, the end of the military aggression in southern Syria, a genuine path towards mutual security and respect for sovereignty for the country. And if you remember and recall, the Israeli position on lifting sanctions on Syria was not very happy. Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to leverage sanctions over Syria to go deeper into the land and occupy more land, or
Yeah.
they were like playing with the Druze cards and saying like
Yeah.
we're going in to protect the Druze. No, the Druze don't need you to protect them. Let's be
And don't
honest.
want to protect them. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think at the end of the day, if we get to resolve those key issues only after these matters are meaningfully addressed, a conversation about peace might happen. Who knows? I personally, if you ask me as a Syrian, I would want that conversation to happen. If that will mean security for Syria and its people who have endured so much so far. Not trying to be, basically ignorant of the Palestinian cause. Absolutely not. But that's a separate conversations and the two are two separate, like completely separate discussions, I think.
No, I think that's right. And the interesting thing for me is that, you've had these sort of discussions happen quite and quite open, right? It's quite publicly, social media and so on. And I think what's a really big sort of elephant in the room is that you're not simply talking about actions that Tel Aviv has taken over the past few months, but the historical occupation of the Golan Heights, and of course the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. And I find it difficult to see a scenario where Tel Aviv would come back from all of that to the extent that would be necessary for Sharia to be able to even begin discussions. I find that hard. You mentioned resistance, and we put that in quotation marks. But the axis of resistance included Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria and Iran. And I
Mhm.
wanted to move on to Iran because, of course, as we're having this conversation, and it'll probably be still a conversation that people are going to be having when this airs, is the negotiations over a new U.S.-Iran deal. And I think it's an interesting discussion because, of course, there was a U.S.-Iran deal, the JCPOA, and that was withdrawn by the Trump administration, and now they're trying to get a new deal. And of course, that on its own is interesting, but also, what does it say about um, American first transactionalism foreign policy in the Middle East, right? Because Trump goes off on like this big major tour, right, to the Gulf. Um, it's a big foreign policy kind of trip, of course. And what does he focus on? He focuses on deals. He focuses on AI in the UAE. He focuses on energy in Saudi. He focuses on a multitude of things with the Qataris, including the sort of upscaling of the base or the renovation of the base, and also other deals, I think, to do with AI as well.
Yeah.
You can begin to see the contours. I won't say a foreign policy doctrine. I don't think it's really that far along yet to be able to call it that, but you see the beginnings of a way of thinking uh, anew when it comes to foreign policy. And you also see that in terms of how he spoke in Riyadh, right? And there was a lot of attention about that, right? That speech about, really drawing a line under neoconservatism, quote unquote, imperial wars in the region. And I do think that this was for a particular audience. Okay, I don't really take it much more beyond that, but it's a part of a packaging, and there's a signaling there, and I think you see that same impetus when he's dealing with Iran, okay? A country and a regime that he clearly does not have good feelings about, but
Right.
had identified that war is not a good idea, that war would not be his first option, um, that war would not deliver, okay, the dividends. And I really do think this is all being constructed. What do we get out of it? What are the dividends behind this? Right? So I think that says something interesting about diplomacy, U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East, at the present moment in time.
Mhm.
But of course, that assumes that we will get to a good point if it succeeds. I don't know. Do you think so? Do you think we're going to see a deal? Do you think that by the time this airs, we're going to have another magic wand wave, or what?
I don't think so. I think, honestly, I have very little hopes of seeing a deal come through, even though I think I like how Trump is going about it, although it's very ad hoc, reactive, and not strategic. In the sense that he's trying to move from the Obama doctrine of the Middle East and
Mm,
moving towards Asia, because let's be honest here. I mean, it's not just about Syria, it's really about the entire region. The Obama administration single-handedly basically gave
mm,
the Middle East to Iran, and that's why we were faced with these problems post the Arab Spring. So I think Trump administration is trying to regain that back, I think the Biden administrations didn't know how to strike a deal. They didn't, they had failed diplomacy in continuing to push the same administration as Obama on Iran. It's been reactive positioning, I think, and it's driven by, crisis containment because Trump doesn't want war, clearly, and he keeps saying that. Um, I think these talks are sort of back channeled as damage control efforts. They are designed to prevent Iran's nuclear breakout rather than produce, durable agreements. Of course, leveraging Israel and sanctions on that. Washington has accepted a less for less kind of approach, even though they walked out from their last meeting completely not in agreement. But the original strategy was less for less, lesser sanctions, lesser nuclear, but tit for tat kind of situation. So that's not durable at all. And there is a lack of leverage and bandwidth at the U.S. administration, whether with the Democrats or the Republicans. I think the Iran file continues to be tricky and sensitive.
Tricky and sensitive when it comes to Iran. Yeah, that's definitely the case. And you mentioned this word bandwidth, which I think is just so crucial in understanding how these negotiations can or cannot succeed. And I think one of the reasons why they got this far this quickly, because it's quick. This is quick. Nobody can say otherwise. What's happened with Syria has been quick. What's happening with
Yeah.
Iran has been quick. And it's because particular people were put on a file and they were outside of the structures that already existed. So Woodcock has been given, certain files, and that's all he does. And he's got the ear of the president. He's got very regular FaceTime with the president, and is moving in that sort of direction. And I tend to think that he's got quite a lot going for him in terms of coming to a deal, because I think also the Iranians are in probably the weakest position they've been in many, many years. On a regional level, geopolitically, even domestically, they're not doing well. So actually, I think that they really want a deal. And I think that it is possible to get to one. But when you say sustainable, I mean, I don't know how sustainable this regime is unless it changes. And I don't know how it can change and still remain this regime. So it has this inbuilt sort of quandary within it, which eventually I think will, something will happen in order for that to be resolved. But I think that that will be from within the system or within Iran. It won't be as a
Yeah.
result of things happening from outside. So my take on this from looking at, how different actors are also engaging on it, regionally speaking, on the European level, nobody wants war. The ones that want war are, a wing of MAGA in the United States, and of course the Israelis, but nobody else does. So on a regional level, for example, we talked about Saudi earlier on, very briefly, but one of the reasons why the relationship between the United States and Saudi changed, and I think for the better, was because Saudi had come to a new arrangement when it came to Iran, and did not see Iran as being the same sort of threat that it had seen it as being previously. And it wasn't because Riyadh had warmed up to Tehran, well, but because they saw a difference in capacity and a difference in tone from Iran. And you saw that also with the Emiratis, right? The Emiratis, who were much more, suspicious about Iran, and I think are still very suspicious, but they're not pushing for a really aggressive policy from the Trump administration. On the contrary, I think that they also want a deal. Because I think everybody has seen that escalation has really led to a bad place in the region. Um, and it's one of the reasons why I think that there's so much antipathy towards the Israelis with regards not only to Gaza, but with regards to Lebanon, with regards to Syria, because escalation is not what is needed. It's de-escalation is what is needed. Um, but then it raises the one question, which I suppose is very difficult for either one of us to answer. But let's try. What if we don't get a deal? What happens if we don't get a deal? Just as a
Uh,
counterfactual, what if we don't get a deal?
I mean, deterioration will continue in the Middle East. I mean, globally. China doesn't seem like they're playing any sort of role in that deal. It's a very tough question, actually. I don't know how to answer it. I'm not gonna lie to you. But I
Well, you
think,
look at China,
you know,
yeah.
I mean, China did play a role with Saudi, between Saudi and Iran, and that sort of led to for Saudi to expand its, kind of not just leaning on the US, but also open more to China. But the recent deal between the US and Saudi kind of sort of they created a shift in that deal, right? I think what the Iranians are doing is that if those talks sort of remain stalled, I think Iran may normalize its nuclear status and, the world will adjust, but they will still invoke some sort of pressures through their axis of resistance. I mean, don't forget the Houthis, they're pretty active. There are pockets of Hezbollah remaining in southern Lebanon, and they're doing the same thing in Syria. That's for the MENA region, obviously. But, the US, on the other hand, if we don't get a deal, will leverage either sanctions, which is already in place, but also Israel. And there has been a lot of, I don't know, rumors or intentional rumors, I don't know what to call them, that Israel is preparing to strike. So it's pretty much unclear, I would say.
Well, Noha, this is called the Institute of Middle East Options podcast, and we've just given them a couple of more options for more podcasts going forward. So we should talk about Saudi and we should talk about China next time around. And we have many other options because this is the Middle East, and in the Middle East, there are so many things that we can sort of peel away in terms of layers. And I'm just pleased that I got to do it over the last 45 minutes with someone as full of insight as yourself. So I want to thank you
Thank
for
you.
joining us today. I want to thank IMEO for inviting both of us. It's been a great pleasure and a privilege. And I want to remind the audience of the next podcast that will be coming along in the series, which will be in June. And I hope to be able to see all of you very soon. Thank you very much. Have a good night, wherever you
So
are.
much. Thank you.